Last week, I asked my viewers to vote on alternate peace deals to end World War II. And I must be honest, the result was so chaotic, I banged my head against the wall to work out a somewhat realistic, but also fun script of where the world goes from it. Final warning for the people who want to avoid spoilers. Alright, this is the new map of Europe. Right off the bat, Stalin is not very happy about the peace deal that has occurred. Had it not been Soviet forces that pushed back the Germans, captured their capital, and ended the European war? Now maybe getting all of Eastern Europe is a bit of a tall ask, but not only did the Soviets gain nothing, apart from Romania and Hungary, they also had to retreat from territories captured before the war. Asia is not much better. The Chinese Civil War is a total mess. For 5 years, the Chinese have struggled against the Japanese invaders, only for nationalist leadership to give Inner Mongolia to Mongolia, sign off on a Manchurian independent state, and agreeing to let the Americans take over Taiwan. This completely discredits the nationalists who were already unpopular for mishandling the war. So, the continuing civil war would be devastating. But without the support of the Chinese people, and with immense Soviet support for the communists, Mao does overrun the entire nation. Without holding Taiwan to run to, the nationalists are completely destroyed. Or at least, that is the communist version of events. But when Mao asks for the return of Taiwan from the Americans, and Stalin requests the Chinese seat in the UN be transferred to the communists instead, the American president shows a different face. Many nationalist soldiers and leaders still fled the nation, and, mockingly, the US sets up a new nationalist government in Taiwan. This move would be condemned internationally and not just by the communist world. Like the Soviets or not, Stalin had proven himself a benevolent actor on the world stage. He had Eastern Europe in his grasp, yet voluntarily retreated all the way in the name of international unity. In contrast, the Americans couldn't even swallow their own pride and accept the new reality in China. This single action would start a road to World War III. Stalin would try to contain Mao's anger, even deciding to return Inner Mongolian territory to China to keep the peace, but it would be in vain. Mao launched twin invasions of Manchuria and Taiwan, and the Manchurian state would be easily overrun. But, due to American intervention, the invasion of Taiwan was a total failure. With these early engagements, the first theater of World War III had begun. But before we continue, a word from our sponsor. Experience the thrill of combat like never before with War Thunder, the ultimate vehicle combat game. Dive into action-packed PvP battles with over 2,000 historical and meticulously designed tanks, planes, helicopters and ships. Every component of each vehicle is designed to perfection, providing an immersive combat experience that's free to play on PC, Xbox and PlayStation 5. The extensive collection of vehicles spans an entire century, from the 1920s to the present day, and thanks to the in-depth customization system, you can even personalize your machines with historical markings and decorations. What sets War Thunder apart for history enthusiasts like ourselves is an unparalleled attention to detail. You won't find a more comprehensive collection of modern warfare vehicles anywhere else. Ready to join the action? Click the link in the description to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox. New players or those returning from a 6-month break can claim a huge bonus package by using my link in the description, giving you multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, exclusive 3D decorations and much more. Available for a limited time only. Back to the war, Stalin watched carefully as Chinese forces stormed down the Korean peninsula. A devastating conflict ensued where modern American forces clashed with masses of Chinese supplied by the Soviets. As this conflict dragged on, elite Western forces were leaving Europe for Asia, while behind the scenes, the Soviets had their army ready for their own adventures. Without warning, for the second time within a decade, Soviet forces were barreling down eastern Poland. And while the Polish armies fought bravely, their 4 years of independence weren't enough to prepare their forces for the Soviet intervention. The Soviets had caused the die. Would the Americans rise to meet the challenge? Now the big issue with intervention was the lack of front lines. All eyes were upon the German monarchies at the heart of the continent. Both sides began offering concessions. Stalin gave Danzig and Silesian territories to the North Germans, hoping to convince them, but the Americans responded by forcing Denmark and the Dutch to return their territories. With this, the loyalty of the North Germans was secured and World War III in Europe could truly begin. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Also, if you want to be a part of the next viewer poll video, the link for that is in the description below. As the West reinstated the former German military structure, Soviet forces began barreling down Eastern Germany. For the second time in 5 years, Soviet forces successfully captured Berlin. With this great progress on the front lines, and the Soviets successfully detonating their first nuke, Stalin had hoped to renegotiate an end to the conflict, offering to retreat from Germany and Czechoslovakia. But the Americans were playing a different game. The West had complete naval supremacy, both in Europe as well as in Asia. Aside from that, while Stalin's nuclear show of force impacted some, the Soviets by this point had around 20 nuclear weapons, while the Americans had more than 300. Also important to keep in mind, nuclear technology was still in their infancy. They were absolutely devastating, but they had to be delivered by airplane, not yet the intercontinental missiles they would become. The American leadership was determined. This is the one and only chance we're ever going to get to destroy communism. And after all, it was them who started this conflict. With the decision for total war made, MacArthur got the go-ahead. A series of nuclear explosions littered Manchuria and Korea, devastating Chinese forces and allowing the Americans to retake the initiative. At the same time, minor raids and offensives into the Soviet Far East were launched, securing the Pacific for the West, meaning that all sides were now open to focus on Europe. Realizing he wouldn't win a long war and desperate to secure a peace deal, Stalin committed to an extreme course of action. His eyes were on Paris, the biggest city in Western Europe. After a dangerous and daring Soviet air raid, a lucky nuke turned the biggest city in Western Europe to rubble. And this attack hardened the war. Up to this point, the war was military. It was strategic. American nukes in Manchuria were devastating, but they were aimed at military facilities, infrastructure, ports. This was a deliberate attack on a civilian target, with no regard for military relevance. As a result, more nations became interested in joining the war. The southern Germans finally threw in their lot with the West, despite the risk of Soviet retribution. In Italy, both sides got involuntarily involved following the escalation of some revolt, leading to a full-scale invasion of northern Italy. Reluctantly, Yugoslavia would allow Soviet forces through, allowing them to supply the Italians. As the front line stabilized, the Soviets don't seem to be in too bad of a position. But behind the scenes, the Soviets were struggling. Sure, their army was large, but it was also running out of men to conscript. Their industry was in decent shape, but it paled in comparison to the American might. Apart from China, which for now can't stand up to the great powers, they have no significant allies. But most of all, the Soviets are struggling with logistics. They are fighting a war half a continent away from their safe territories. This is made worse by the Forest Brothers rebellion in the Baltics, German and Polish resistance movements, and anti-Soviet rebellions in Romania. As the Western powers regroup, they prepare for Operation Unthinkable. The operation meant to destroy the Soviet Union. But let's move back over to Asia, where despite the front lines being stale, the continent is still on fire. But the focus isn't on China versus the West, but the biggest conflicts right now are in India and Indonesia. Both regions are divided in very arbitrary ways. Now that the world is in chaos, these borders won't hold either. Several actors are calling for complete reunification, while others are arguing for a religious solution or just plain old conflict for territories. While for our story, these conflicts are just a side theater which I will not even predict an ending for, the casualties here alone would rival those of World War I. But back to Europe, where nukes are increasingly used by both sides for terror and strategic goals. Several actors do try to discuss peace, and as the West achieve a major breakthrough, Tito is the first to buckle. With Yugoslavia having the luxury of not being a Soviet puppet, they suddenly refused to assist Soviet forces, causing a true disaster for the Soviet forces in the nation. Yugoslavia has proven themselves to be the weak underbelly of the communist world, choosing to save their own regime rather than fighting for global communism. The collapse of the Soviets was still slow and painful, but by now secure. Stalin desperately resorted to the same tactics he used against the Germans before, but they wouldn't deter the West. Wherever the West advanced, they were hailed as liberators, and eventually, the Soviet military just couldn't bear the weight of the conflict anymore. After a coup, Stalin was removed from life, and the Soviets officially collapsed. But the war was not over. We now shift back to Asia, where a delusional Mao just completely refuses to surrender. The Soviets at least had their own nukes to resist with, but China has none. With China unwilling to surrender, the West has two choices: nuke China into submission, or commit to a land invasion of a nation of 350 million people. The continuing war in China would be absolutely horrific, especially for the Chinese population. Tens of millions of deaths, and while the West would undoubtedly win eventually, by the time that they do, the Chinese casualties have reached into the tens of millions again. The war is won, but what is next? In China, the nationalist government is restored on the mainland, also reclaiming Inner Mongolia and ending the short-lived independence of Manchuria, while a democratic regime emerges in Mongolia. You may think that this is a great outcome from China, but no. The nationalists were already disliked before the war, but after they allied themselves with the West against the communists and the devastation that World War III has brought, they would simply be seen as another Western puppet regime, while the brief Maoist regime is immortalized as a short but glorious break from the century of humiliation. To add to this, China is completely destroyed. Between 1937 and the end of the war, the Japanese invaded, there was a civil war, and right after, there was World War III. Each conflict killing millions and devastating the land. China, by this point, is weak, unstable, rife with civil conflict, and will only remain intact due to harsh military repression. Korea isn't doing much better. United under the American candidate Syngman Rhee, Korea too is a brutal, authoritarian state following the war. Their early economy does even worse, as without a communist China or Korea to worry about, there is no reason for extensive American aid. In the short term, at least, Korea is much weaker. Japan then is still turned into a solid capitalist democracy under the American occupation, but with one absolutely crucial change. Japan doesn't have the luxury of pacifism. While, to prevent controversy, Japanese forces only took on defensive roles in Korea and Taiwan, Japanese forces still played a major role in the Asian theater of World War III. Japan, as a militarized power, is here to stay. Now over in Europe, we can once again reshape a continent. Any restrictions on Germany have now been lifted, and Germany's role in the war has offered them a place amongst the Western world. Italy reunifies as a monarchy, adding to the massive amount of monarchies that now remain in Europe, as weirdly, World War II and III restored many of them to Central Europe. To the east, Romania and Hungary are restored, with a new border arrangement which will satisfy neither power. Poland once again sees their pre-war government reformed, but their eastern territories are stripped into Belarus and Ukraine, who become independent after the complete collapse of the Soviet Union into new, for now, democratic states. Finally, the Baltic states are once again reinstated. This is the new Europe after World War III. At the heart of the continent are now the German states. Do they remain separate or move towards closer integration? With how recent their separation was, some form of reunited German Confederation could be achieved. And looking at this Germany, which is significantly bigger than it used to be in 1936, the question is often raised. Did they really lose the war? Conversely, not all is in a map. Germany has, by population, been amongst the hardest hit in the world after both world wars. Germany is still devastated. To prevent new conflict to rise up in Europe, a European community is set up, far bigger than it was initially in our own timeline. It's not united against a communist threat, but is simply an organization united out of a shared interest in peace, capitalism and democracy, collectively working towards a brighter future for the continent. For now, most of Europe, and indeed the world, is united under democratic ideals. But will the new, untested democracies hold, or will a resurgence of aggressive nationalism take hold in regions like Russia? Either way, the world we have created has a simple ruler: the Americans. China, Russia, Germany, Japan and Britain. They have all been massively weakened during the 3 world wars, while America is now the only nuclear power, easily the largest military power, has the only intact industry, etc, etc. The only question now is, will America wield this power to lead the world towards a more fair and prosperous future, or will discontent with the American world order fester as they perhaps get a little too comfortable with their position of power? Before we go, don't forget to go to the link in the description to join War Thunder today and get a limited time sign up bonus. It is completely free and playable on PC, Xbox and PlayStation, so really, what are you waiting for? A massive thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Thank you all for watching, consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content against the algorithm, and subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen now. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.